This video will cover key concept number 5 on your study guide. This inverse functions question is very similar to the free response question that will be on your test on Thursday or Friday. And this will be the second free response question. All right, so number 1 says, let A equal f of n equal 1 over 400 n be the amount of yellow paint in gallons needed to paint n square feet of a house. Find a formula for the inverse function x equals inverse of f for the input of t. Okay, so normally how we started these last week is by thinking about what the inputs and the outputs of the function are, because it's going to be helpful later in the problem. So we said, okay, A equals f of n. We know that A is the output, and we know that n is the input. And since this is a word problem, units are going to be really important here. So let's think about what the units of input n are. So here we have let A be the amount of yellow paint in gallons needed to paint n square feet. So we can see A is the amount of yellow paint, which is going to be our output, and to paint n square feet of a house, which is our input. So the units of our output, the units of A, is going to be gallons of paint specifically, and the units for n is going to be square feet, like the amount of square feet that you can paint given a certain number of gallons of paint. Okay, so we're going to come back to that later. For now, for part A, we're going to find a formula for the inverse function. So for this particular procedure of finding inverse functions, it's normally helpful to take your equation and just write it with y and x. So instead of all of this, f of n equals 1 over 400n, I'm going to rewrite as y equals 1 over 400x. That just makes it easier for me personally. So I'd call that first step replace output with y, input with x. By the way, on your test, I won't expect you to write out words for all the steps. This is just helpful as you're reviewing and studying to apply language to all of the math that you're seeing. It's just helpful for your brain to process it in two different representations. Okay, the next step is going to be to switch x and y. The reason we did this is if we go back to earlier in the study guide, our definition of inverse functions, we can see the definition of an inverse function is inputs and outputs switch places. In other words, your x values and your y values switch places to create an inverse function. So, inverse function, also notated by this symbol here, f negative 1. They both mean the same thing, which is inputs and outputs are switching places. So this is one of those math problems where we have to know the definition of this in order to solve, or else we wouldn't know what to do unless we knew this definition. Okay, so what would this equation look like if we switch x and y? Well, we'd have x equals 1 over 400y. All right, and there's our inverse function. It's an equation that relates x and y. We're going to isolate y because it's just going to look better that way. And that's how we're used to seeing math equations written, is with y isolated on one side. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 400 to cancel out the denominator. And I'm going to end up with, I'm just going to switch the sides, y equals 400x. So I move this over here and this over here. the 400's canceled out, so I'm just left with 1y, otherwise known as y, and 400 times x. I just rewrote that as 400x. Okay, the last step might be to add f negative 1. So instead of y, we could just write this as the inverse. And in this case, they want us to use t equals 400x. And that would be our final answer for the inverse function. I would also accept y equals 400x, but technically since the question asked for the inverse in this notation, it's good to put it in that final notation. Okay, so now comes the hard part. Calculate and interpret f of 20 and the inverse function at 20. Let's start with f of 20. As I'm structuring my response, I'm actually going to use this checklist that we used for these types of questions last week. In order to get full points, in order to have a fully built out response to these questions, you need to make sure you have all of these elements because of this word interpret. So interpret in math tells us we're going to be kind of like structuring an argument. We're not just going to be doing math. So we're going to use English language as well. Okay, so I'm going to start with my sentence starter. First we have and I'm going to calculate f of 20. So I want to ask myself if this is the inverse function or the original function, and because it's just f, it's going to be the original function. So I can actually just go back up to the equation I was given in the problem, which is 1 over 400x, and all I'm going to do is just plug in 20 for x. So I end up with 1 over 400 times 20. 1 over 400, if I do that in my calculator, I will get 0.0025 times 20. Will give me 0.05 as my final answer. So now what we normally did is we connected our input and output. So f of 20, I found out after all that math, it's equal to 0.05. I'm going to go ahead and label the units of this because it's going to help me write my sentence. So the units, I can go back up to what I found at the beginning of the problem. My output is going to be in gallons of paint. And my input is going to be square feet. Okay, now to put this in a sentence, I'm going to go back and use my next sentence starter. This indicates that when in order to paint 20 square feet, you need 0.05 gallons of paint. All right, and let me make sure I use that. I want to make sure that the input is first in the sentence. It's just an important grammatical thing. So let's see, my input is 20 square feet, and it looks like 20 square feet comes first grammatically in the sentence, so I know I'm on a good track. And I want to use units with the input. I did that, I used square feet. And then I wrote output second in the sentence, and I used units with the output as well. So here is my output, comes second in the sentence, and it has units that go with it as well. All right, I'm going to go ahead and repeat the process for the inverse function. So second, we have inverse at 20. And for this one, let me think about which equation to use. I'm not going to use my original equation. I'm actually going to use the inverse equation that I found, which is right here. I found it in part A. 400x, 400 times 20, plugging in 20 for x, and I'm going to get 8,000. All right, now to connect my input and my output, I have f-1 of 20 equals 8,000. I'm going to go ahead and label my units again. Key thing to realize, for your inverse function, the inputs and the outputs are going to switch places. So square feet, this unit is going to switch to the output, and the input is now gallons of paint. So inputs and outputs are switching places for our inverse function. And now the unit for my input is square feet, and the unit for my output is gallons of paint. Okay, now I'm going to write my sentence. This indicates that my input comes first in the sentence, that, oh, I made a mistake in annotating this. I forgot to switch the inputs and the outputs. So the gallons of paint is going to be for the inputs. And the outputs is going to be in terms of square feet, because it should be the opposite of the original function. So these should flip places. Okay, so inputs first, that in order, let's see what makes sense, in order to use 20 gallons of paint, you would need to paint 8,000 square feet. So my input's coming first in the sentence, 20 gallons of paint, and my output is coming second. So the last thing I would probably do is just make sure that my answers make sense. So thinking about just logically, does it make sense that to paint 20 square feet of a wall, like maybe the size of one wall in this classroom, I would need about 0.05 gallons of paint, so very small amount of paint. Yes, that makes sense. It doesn't take very much paint to paint 20 square feet because paint spreads very thinly over the surface. Does it make sense that to use 20 gallons of paint, I would need to paint 8,000 square feet? Yeah, that makes sense. 20 gallons of paint is a lot of paint, and I would need to paint a lot of square feet, about 8,000 square feet, like the outside of the school building, in order to use that amount of paint. So it's always good to check your answers for logical sense in the context of the problem. All right, that is your second free response question. I highly encourage you to use this checklist to try the similar problem on the practice exam. Use that answer key. Just really make sure that you have down how to structure these responses as well as follow the procedures. Okay, thank you for your attention. Happy studying.